Okay, so I'm zoomed way in here. What we're going to do is for worksheet 4, I want you to go to YouTube and look at this this particular video. It's going to show you why the math works with what we're going to do right here. It's a really good video. Guy has a cool accent. Here's the right here, the link to it. You can type that in, or you could just search for. I just did scratch bounce off round object, but this is the name of his video here. So try that out and watch this before you come back to my video and then continue on with the worksheet. Okay, this will just make everything make more sense. All right, so do it. All right, now that you've watched that video, you should be ready to make some pegs and be able to bounce off of them correctly. It's just a little bit different than the kicker. The kicker, the ball just goes towards it, looks at it, and bounces off. And that's only the half the amount of the bounce off angle that you need. So that's why we need to do the other method for the pegs, because the pegs aren't pushing the ball away, so it's going to bounce off of them more naturally. All right. So to bounce off a peg, we have to make one. So click on the little paintbrush, and I always like to go to vector mode. So down here on the very bottom right, I'll zoom all the way in, and because they're fairly small. I'll hold down Shift on your keyboard and drag it out. I like to make my pegs about 20 by 20. Right there, about that size. Make sure it's in the middle. Okay, right here in the middle. Your kickers need to be perfectly centered. Your ball needs to be perfectly centered. If any of these round objects aren't perfectly centered, then you're going to have weird rotations and stuff when the ball bounces and stuff, because it does all the calculations based off of the center of the object, which should be exactly in the center. All right. So once you have that, then I'm going to decorate it, of course. If you want to take more time, just pause the video and do that. I'm going to move on. Okay, so go back to scripts, and here is a peg. So we have 2 kickers and 1 peg right now. We'll make more pegs later, but for now, let's just focus on the one. All right. So we're going to click on the ball, so we have the code of the ball over here. And then just like we have a defined gravity, we're going to define what happens when we hit a peg. All right. Do you see where we have kicker, and then we have all this code, then we have kicker 2, and then we have all this code? We could put all this code into a block, and that's what we're going to do with the peg. If you want to modify the kickers to do what we're doing with the pegs, you can. That's one of the extra above and beyond things that you can do, but that's on your own. Okay, so to do that, we click on make a block, and this is what we want the ball to do when it hits a peg. So we'll just call it hit peg, and I don't put spaces in there. It won't hurt on Scratch, but when you get into more advanced programming, we usually don't use spaces, so get in the practice now. Okay, we're going to use in this one what we call a string input. Okay, it's kind of like a variable, and then we're going to click on run without screen refresh, because we want whatever happens in this function to happen really fast. So I say, okay, actually, no, we're going to name it. Instead of string 1, what we're going to do is, because we're going to have more pegs later on, when you hit a peg, we're going to tell it which peg we're hitting. Okay? And so we're going to type in which peg, or we could say the peg. Okay, the peg that we are hitting at this moment in time is what that's, and you can name this Bob, Frank, whatever you want to call it, but it helps to make it a name that makes sense. All right, so then you get another one of these define hit pegs, and so now we're going to tell it what to do when it hits a peg. We're going to come to our main program and tell it when to go there. So if we hit the peg, so if then, just like we did with the kicker, okay? So make sure you put it right here. Don't put it inside the if statement of the kicker. Put it in its own little section so it's inside the forever loop, okay? So if we are touching the peg, I'm going to stop this for a second. Okay, so to know if we're touching something, that's sensing. So we go to sensing, and right here there's a touching. And it says mouse pointer, but you can change it to whatever you want. Now this says sprite 1. That's something I forgot to do. I forgot to change this to peg, okay? So on a little I and name it to peg, go back to the ball. Here we go. Now it'll make more sense. Instead of saying sprite 1, we know we're talking about a peg. That just makes your code easier to read for somebody else or the teacher. When the teacher comes, they'll be like, what's sprite 1? Then I have to look over in your code and your sprites and see which one is which, and it just is annoying. So make sure you name everything properly. Touching the peg, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to jump over to the hit peg function or block. So to jump over there, grab the hit peg block. So this is saying, hey, jump over here. Now this right here is where it says the peg. So wherever we put the peg in our program over here, it'll replace it with whatever we type in right here. And so we want to type in exactly what it says right here. And it is peg with a capital P. Now, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but as soon as you click in there, there are 2 spaces. And sometimes a student will click in there, hit an arrow key, and then type in peg, and that won't work right there because, believe it or not, that it takes into account the spaces. So make sure there is no space before or after the name. Okay, so just double check all that stuff. Make sure they're spelled exactly the same. Make sure the capitalization is exactly the same. Everything should be exactly the same. Otherwise, it won't work. Because what happens is now it's going to say, okay, I'm going to come over here and run this program. And wherever we drag this down into the program, it's going to think this instead. All right, so let's go ahead and start doing this. Got my handy dandy instructions here. I'm going to try to follow it exactly the same way that you would. So, all right. Ooh, we need to create some variables to use. All right, so to create variables, this is where more blocks is where you create functions, and data is where you create variables. So we're going to create 2 of them. All right, and let's see here. Okay, they're going to be local variables. So you're going to say for this sprite only, and that means only the ball can see these numbers. Nothing else can see them because we only want the ball using them, so we don't want to be confused with, when we're in another code and see more variables than we need. So to say for this sprite only, we're going to name it MyAngle. And then another one called Your Angle. If you watched the video that I recommended before, he used angle and incidence or something like that. We're doing the same code, but we're using different names for our variables. So hopefully that doesn't confuse you too much. don't forget for this sprite only, say okay. So my angle is for the ball to remember its original angle, and then your angle is going to be how it turns and moves on. Okay, all right, here we go. Let's actually make it happen here. Okay, so let's start dragging stuff over into here. What we're going to do is follow the example in the video before. Now, if you're following the worksheet, I don't know if we're going to change it, but the worksheet actually has a slightly different method. It's but it'll work. So if you're following the worksheet exactly, yours will look different than mine, but they both work. I just like this one better because it has less chance of you putting the equation together wrong. You'll notice a difference in the worksheet unless we change the worksheet. What I'm going to do here is first set, we're going to use the variables that we created. So we're going to set MyAngle. So basically we're using the variable MyAngle to remember which direction you were going, because we're going to move the ball and it's going to forget where it was. So this is like saying to your buddy, hey, can you remember this number for me? And your buddy's name is MyAngle. All right, so we're going to set it to the direction that the ball is going at that moment in time. So go to motion, and down at the very bottom you see direction, and just drag it up there and stick it in there. That way it will the ball knows where it's going and the direction, and but as soon as you change it, it forgets. So you use MyAngle to remember. Okay, so now we're going to change our direction. We're going to point at the peg, which is just like we did with the kicker, but we're going to change it a little bit after that. So we're going to point towards, okay? And now instead of clicking here and saying peg, what we're going to do is drag this down, and it's just going to type in peg for us because we typed it in here. This is where using these string inputs makes it valuable, is because when we make more pegs, all we have to do is just copy these two blocks and not this whole entire program that we're making right now. And so it will automatically type in what we want. All we have to do is type it in once. So this comes in handy when you want to do it a whole lot of times and you want to save space in your code. All right, so as soon as we look at the peg, then we're going to use our other variable to keep track of stuff, which is your angle. Okay, so we set your angle, and this is where mine is different than the instructions. Okay, we're going to go direction minus MyAngle. So we need an operator with a minus sign. All right, you can stick it in now, or you can put it together and then stick it in. Doesn't matter. We want direction minus MyAngle. So direction is in here. Direction minus MyAngle. Well, where's MyAngle? You go to data and say MyAngle, drag it over, boom. Okay, so it remembers what direction you're going before. So basically you're saying the direction, after I look at the peg, take the direction I'm going now, minus the direction I was going earlier to find out how much I turned. Okay, and then you want to flip around 180 minus that amount to get the proper thing. So instead of just turning 180, now we're turning 180 minus this amount so that you get the proper reflection. Makes perfect sense now, right? Okay, so you can rewind that and listen to it a couple times until it finally makes sense. But so we're going to turn left. We're going to need another minus sign. So go to operators, drag a minus in there, and say, let's actually just type in 180. And then in this other one, you want your angle. So go back to data and drag over your angle and drop it in there. Okay, let's see how it works. It's not going to work perfectly, but we want you to see what goes wrong. Anyway, so here it comes. You can see it, and it actually works mostly. So let's show you what happens once the ball gets going really fast. I got it. It might not bounce off of it properly. Oh, come on. Okay, I can control this ball, right? Let me grab it. Tricky little guy. Okay, so I'm gonna grab it. I'm gonna put it right on top of the peg. Watch what happens. And it gets stuck. It gets stuck on there, and it doesn't know what to do. And so right there, that's kind of fun. If I speed it up, you see how it can get stuck on the peg. And if you watch the whole video that I recommended, he had a solution to that, where you just back away from the peg before you do the equation. Because what's happening is it's stuck doing this because it's overlapping the peg. And as your ball goes faster and faster, you'll notice that the spacing between each instance of it gets further and further apart. So it might, when it hits the peg, be overlapping it. So we got to fix that. Let's stop it. All right. So we got to do, let's see here. All right. We got to write another function called back off. All right. This is better than what the guy had in the video that I had you watch. He just had it back off a certain amount every time. We're going to have it back off the perfect amount every time. All right. And to do that, there's just a little bit of code that we need. It's not bad. So more blocks, and we're going to call this function or block, back off. Back off. All right. So back off, and then we're going to say whatever we're backing off of. And so we're going to be using this back off command a lot, and not just on pegs. So we're not going to say the peg, we're going to say the object. So here we go, the object. So whatever we want it to back off of, we type it in there so it knows what we want it to do back off of. And run without screen refresh, because we want it to do this really fast. All right, so back off. Here we go. And because we're using this a lot, that's why we're making a block for it. It's because there's multiple things that we're having it do, and we don't want to have to do that a million times. All right, so here we go. Okay, in the video, he backed off a certain amount, and in this one, we're going to back off one step at a time until it's not touching the object that we're talking about. So we go to control, and basically we're going to do something until something else is true or not true. So there is this really cool thing right here. It says repeat until. So we want to repeat until we're not touching the object. Now in the sensing we have touching, but we don't have a not touching. So we can easily change that by going to operators and finding the not. So if you drag a not and put that inside of it, now we're having not touching the object. And so instead of using this, if we drag this in here, then whenever we say back off and type in what we want, it'll back off of whatever we want, and we won't have to pick it in the drop-down menu, because all we have to do is type it once. So not touching the object. What are we going to do? We're going to go in reverse. So we say move, and then say -1. Nice, right? And then all we have to do is go here, say back off, And we don't have to type it in because we already have it typed, and we just say the peg. Voila. Cool, right? All right, let's see how that works. So what should happen is it shouldn't get stuck on the peg because it's going to back off until it's not touching it, and then it'll do the rest of the program here. So it should work perfectly, even if I stick it on there and hit play. Boom. Perfect every time. All right. So there is one other thing that the worksheet wants you to do. It doesn't really affect it on the peg, but it will affect it on other objects that we're going to use, that we're going to bounce off of if they're not round. So when we do a bounce and your ball rotates and then goes to move off of an object, sometimes the object might be in a weird shape. And so just to be perfect here, we're going to make another one of these. Let's stop it here. Make another block, and we're going to call this one move on. So it's going to move away from the object, so it's not touching it anymore. So there's no chance of it getting stuck in there. So we're going to call it move on. Move on, and string input, and we'll say the object. Now I'm going to do something interesting here. I'm going to do it slightly different. Show you something that could go wrong with your code, and just show you what to look for. I'll say okay. Now you'll notice a slight difference between these. The object is capitalized on the T, and this one is not. So if you do something like that accidentally, I did it on purpose to show you what could happen here, and I'm like, well, my move on is almost exactly the same as the back off, except the move one, negative one, is going to be positive over here. So if you're being lazy and decided to duplicate that and drag it over here and just change the negative 1 to 1 like that, you're like, okay, I'm good. And then this doesn't work because this right here and this right here are different. So if you ever copy paste code that has the string in it from your define block, be very careful about doing that, because if it's even a little bit different, it won't work. So even if they are typed the same and you copy paste it over, I would always get rid of that and drag down the new one, because you want to make sure that it's using this one and not the one from another function, okay, or another block. So just trying to help you avoid issues with your code, because those are issues that I've seen students have. So sorry about me talking for a long time about each thing, but the reason I do it is because these are all problems that I've seen people have, and I want you to be able to avoid them. All right, so I think that's it as far as the worksheet is concerned, except for making one more peg. Let's say I wanted to make a bunch of them. So if I right click and duplicate that peg a couple times. Okay, so now I have 4 pegs, and they're called peg, peg 2, peg 3, peg 4. So just this one if statement won't work. So I have to right click and duplicate the if statements. Okay. Oh, I can do this. Watch this. Right click, duplicate, and that does 2 of them. So now I got 4. But I have to change this to peg 2, this one to peg 3, this one to peg 4. And a lot of students will do that and then run the program, and it doesn't work. And the main reason is because they forgot to change this. And if you just click on it, hit the right arrow and the number 2. And then click on this one, right arrow, number 3, so on and so forth. Or that's the fast way for me to do it. Anyway, otherwise, make sure you delete everything out of it, get rid of all the spaces, and then type in the name and make sure they match perfectly. Now when I play the game, it should work. I'm going to create a wall of pegs here, and let's see how well this works. being trapped in here. All right, here we go. Oh, I just did that wrong. All right, there. Oh, it got out, but that's pretty cool how it works. There we go. Let's try again. There. Yeah, that's going at speed 16. Bump it up to 28, 33. Now the ball is 30 in diameter, so you can see it's starting to skip past itself. Once you go past like 40 or 45, the ball's gonna get out of it no matter what. That's because it's skipping so fast from frame to frame that it just doesn't even register the fact that it collided with anything from one step to the next step. So don't let your ball go above like 25 or 30 on speed. Otherwise, you're going to have lots of collision issues. Okay. Anyway, so that's the end of this video. I'll see you on number 5.